Well, it's for the hard currency countries. There'll be a number of speakers who will, speak.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. So I'm joined by Paul Polizzotto, who is the founder and CEO of Givewith, a social impact technology company that brings together companies and nonprofits to generate new funding for social impact initiatives. Now, he's also the founder of EcoMedia that was sold to CBS in 2010, and he is a senior fellow at USC's Marshall School of Business. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks for having me, Scott. Appreciate it.
All right. So my first question for you is, I believe you're very passionate about surfing, and you've been surfing for a long time. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. I'm here actually in Southern California. I've been sheltered in place here for what is going on 4 months. But yeah, this is the part of the country I'm from. I'm from Southern California. I grew up in Manhattan Beach and grew up surfing at a very, very young age. In fact, I surfed last night, so I'm still surfing. But my whole career in social entrepreneurship started 32 years ago, and started because of surfing. You know, growing up in Southern California and being involved in what is a very healthy sport, but in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s, we were sick all the time. And so I was really curious about what was happening in Los Angeles, the activities that were going on around stormwater and urban runoff that were contributing to the pollution that was making us sick. And what I saw all those years ago at the age of 25 was that there were activities happening where contractors were cleaning industrial sites, manufacturing facilities, parking facilities, even bioinfected waste areas of hospitals, and washing the pollutants into the storm drain system and ultimately into the bay. And I looked at that and said, not only is that making us sick, it's illegal. It's a non-stormwater discharge. It's a violation of the Federal Clean Water Act. And if we could come up with a compliant way to do that, we could keep those pollutants from entering the bay, and we could legitimize and legalize an industry. And so I pioneered something called urban watershed cleaning and a process called zero discharge. Later won an award from the United States Environmental Protection Agency for the creation of those methods. And my company created a service where building owners and managers could be compliant, and those activities would no longer pollute the bay. And so my career in social entrepreneurship started 32 years ago, at the age of 25, because of my love for the ocean.
Yeah, it's interesting because, when I go to Southern California especially and go by some of the most pristine beaches, even the pristine beaches, at some point you're going to run across some sort of a, canal. Basically, it's the pipe system, the sewer pipe system that goes into the ocean. And in that area, you could see all the junk, and you could see the discoloration of the water, and that stuff is going right into the ocean. I want to go a little bit deeper into when you said, the surfers were getting sick. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that was like, and was that fairly pervasive? Was it fairly localized to where you were?
No, it's very, very pervasive in the entire basin, because in Southern California, we have separate systems. So stormwater and sewer, that is the treatment of what is largely human waste, those are separate systems. So anything that goes into the storm drain system is ultimately going to go into the bay untreated. There is not a filtration system large enough to deal with this vast basin. So there are tens of millions of gallons of toxic runoff going into Santa Monica Bay. I'm talking about from Malibu to Palos Verdes, so I'm talking about the whole bay. On a perfectly dry day, just from people watering their lawns, washing their cars, these pollutants are finding their way into the bay on a perfectly dry day. So these separate systems are quite problematic. And I was really interested in reducing the types of activities that would contribute to that pollution. The urban watershed cleaning, Scott, was for me very interesting because I saw the opportunity to clean parking lots, industrial sites, because we have a very distinct rainy season, meaning it just doesn't rain here until late into October, and it won't rain for sometimes 250 consecutive days. And so my thinking was, what if we clean those surfaces in September, early October, remove those pollutants so that when the rain finally hits, the amount of runoff going into the storm drain system is ultimately reduced. Then also cleaning the storm drain systems in September and October, because what ends up happening is these pollutants, everything from leaves to all sorts of human waste and pet waste, finds its way into those storm drain systems, and it sits all summer. Bacterial levels rise, and then what we get in October, sometimes early November, is what we call the first flush, and it's the whole system ultimately discharges into the bay. And you had, back in the 70s, like a 15-foot layer of toxic stew from the whole sort of basin flushing itself from the first significant rain. And so I was really interested on reducing the amount of pollutants that would be part of that first flush.
Yeah, it's interesting because these storm drain systems that you're talking about really doesn't have any type of filtration system like the typical sewer and the recycling processes.
Right.
So anything that goes in, really it's an open system and it just goes right into the ocean. Now, it's interesting that your initiatives focused on the surfaces that led to the source that led to the pollution. But did you also take any initiatives around putting any type of technology or solutions on the actual storm drain systems themselves, so there's a bit of a filtration in the process?
Yeah. Later, Scott, I was very interested in catch basin filters, and this was at a time in the 90s when there was some technology developing around stormwater catch basin filtration, not only just for trash and debris, but some of that filtration started to evolve into oil and grease and other abilities to deal with bacteria. So later, from the creation of my first business, I grew interested in a program that I created called Adopt a Waterway, where we would actually have corporate sponsorship of signs along streets where the catch basins, we would equip with those catch basin filters as a result of the sponsorship of those corporations. And I created the Adopt a Waterway program. And
that's terrific. And actually, I do recall seeing signs of that throughout my lifetime in California. So that's incredible.
I created that program. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was exciting. Yeah.
So let's segue into your other company that you founded called EcoMedia that was sold to CBS. Can you tell me kind of that transition from the surface cleaning and Adopt a Highway to this EcoMedia that focused on eco ad, wellness ad, educational ads, and allocated some of the portions of the revenue to sustainability causes?
Yeah, so I was not from media and advertising. I just shared with you that my background was originally in the environmental space, and so I looked at what was happening in this country, and I was starting to work with governors, mayors, county boards of supervisors, and nonprofits, because in addition to stormwater and urban runoff pollution prevention plans, I also grew increasingly interested in what cities were doing around municipal climate action plans. And so, as you know, here in the United States, we dealt with climate quite differently. It was really a bottoms-up approach, where the United States did not sign the Kyoto Protocol, and instead, mayors and county boards of supervisors and governors began to embrace the goals and objectives of the Kyoto Protocol, and ultimately put in place municipal climate action plans and statewide climate action plans. And I saw those activities and wanted to be involved in helping to fund some of the efforts around 20% reductions by 2020, 50%, 80% reductions by 2050, and knew that was going to be very expensive. So I started to look at ways to try to bring funding to those activities. And so what happened was I wanted to create a nonprofit. So here I had the successful environmental business that I shared with you, and I started working with mayors, county boards of supervisors, governors, and nonprofits around some really exciting projects where those organizations had brought a lot of the money together, but not all the money. They needed a little bit of gap financing to get fully funded and off the shelf and into the community. So I thought, well, I'll start a nonprofit and I'll win grants and help get these projects off the shelf and into these communities. So I started the origins of EcoMedia as a nonprofit. And what happened was I started winning grants, Scott, and I realized, wait a minute, I'm taking a grant out of an existing grant pie. This grant would have gone to another nonprofit had not gone to me. And all I could do was say that it's better with me than it is with that other important organization doing important work. And what made matters worse was that some of my friends were the executive directors of these nonprofits. And so my friends were like, Paul, we think what you're doing is really cool, but you know you're taking our grants now, you're competing with us. And that's what led to that sort of transition into what became EcoMedia. So I started the origins of EcoMedia as a nonprofit. And what led me to advertising was some of the work that I was doing around the Adopt a Water Rate program, which was in a way outdoor advertising. But I knew that the amount of money that was going to be required for this project was much larger and needed to be more comprehensive across other media assets. And back then, I saw two things happening in media and advertising. First, I saw what was happening in cause marketing. And I'm talking about, 20 years ago, cause marketing to me looked historical facing. It looked backward facing. It's something that a brand had done in the past that they wanted to share with the consumer, that the consumer had nothing to do with, but the brand wanted to tell you about it anyway. And I thought, well, what if cause marketing could be forward facing? What if something new and tangible and measurable could happen in the future because the brand and the consumer agree? When brands and consumers agree, great things happen for brands. And I was really interested in this idea of story, empathy, action, in real time. And when brands underwrite human empathy, great things happen for brands. I didn't want brands to ask consumers to make donations. I wanted brands to underwrite social impacts on behalf of the consumers in exchange for engagement. And so I was really interested, and I'll give you an idea of what I mean. So Dell is a partner of ours, right? And Dell comes out with their 13-inch laptop, their new XPS. 25% of the packaging of the XPS is made from ocean plastics. Okay, that's great. Back to my roots. What if, Dell, every time you told the consumer that your product was made from ocean plastics, what if we funded a nonprofit that was retrieving and repurposing ocean plastics? Talk about it and do it in real time. So we created a campaign where we created the display units, Facebook posts, landing pages, custom videos. And so the display unit said, this ad cleans oceans. You click, we'll give. And what happened is when consumers engaged, Dell would underwrite a contribution to the Waterkeeper Alliance for two projects, one in Mexico, one in Costa Rica, that were retrieving and repurposing ocean plastics. So I was really interested in that kind of cause marketing, where engagement led to new and tangible, measurable benefits for the environment and people in need. And so that was going on in my head. The other thing that was going on in my mind was the commoditization and how media was becoming increasingly commoditized and increasingly competitive. And that's where I started thinking, I believe that social impacts can be a differentiator in this commoditized and competitive marketplace. And so I began to purchase ad time on different platforms and added our social impact capabilities where those social impacts would lead to new and tangible, measurable benefits for communities. And we would sell that advertising at a premium. One of the companies that I was purchasing the media from was CBS. And CBS saw that I was bringing new advertisers to CBS, and they saw that I was bringing advertisers off cycle. And they started saying, wait, what is Paul and EcoMedia doing to our 30-second ad units, our commodity, that we get new advertisers to buy it, existing advertisers to come in off cycle and actually spend more on CBS? So we entered into a joint venture in 2008 and 2009, where I wanted to show them that social impacts as a differentiator, as a sales tool. In effect, my career for the last 22 years has been applying social impacts as a sales tool. I looked at all the tools that sellers have. Marketing, advertising, PR, corporate communications, events, conferences, white papers, free shipping, volume discounts, rebates, extended warranties, and said, there is a tool missing from your toolkit. That social impacts applied to a business-to-business transaction or business-to-government transaction can actually create more value for the seller and the buyer, the supplier and the buyer, than those other client acquisition tools.
Yeah. So, Paul, let me ask you, because you were doing this back in 2009 to 2010, and we're in 2020, and social impact-driven sales and marketing has become not only the buzzword, but kind of a default of how large corporations are supposed to behave. And I think, especially at the time of this recording, with Black Lives Matter movements, we are seeing a pivotal change in terms of marketers using it for marketing ploy versus really starting to embed it into their DNA. And that actually kind of brings us to the next segue, which is, what is Givewith and how does Givewith really transform and, more importantly, quantify some of these transformational changes that's happening with the big brands?
Yeah, so no, I appreciate that. And these are indeed interesting times. And I think there's opportunities, Scott, for us to leverage the power of the economy, the power of just transactions, goods and services being exchanged for value as an agent for social change. So what I think is that I'm hoping that the in business-to-business transactions, business-to-government transactions, that what is actually being exchanged, the product, okay, will be more sustainable. But what we're doing is that we're leveraging just the fact that there's a transaction itself between a seller and a buyer. The power of transactions have the power to transform. The way our platform works, and maybe this will help explain what I'm talking about. In this case, we are integrated, Givewith is integrated into SAP Ariba. SAP Ariba is the largest business-to-business digital marketplace in the world, where roughly 4.4 million suppliers and buyers are doing nearly or roughly $3 trillion in transactions. And so the way our platform works is that we're integrated into an Ariba platform where, let's say the buyer wants to buy. In this case, let's say the buyer is the CBS Corporation. This is an actual case study. So CBS Corporation wants to buy computers and printers. And they're going to put out an RFP that says, hey, we're looking for computers and printers, but we're looking for the responders to this RFP to consider underwriting a social impact as part of their response. In this case, HP is the supplier, and HP says, we have computers and printers, and they negotiate the best pricing and the best terms. And HP says, we will take a fraction of the transaction and underwrite social impacts through Givewith as part of our response that are going to positively influence your ESG rating, environmental social governance rating. We're going to help you with employee engagement and retention. We're going to help you with investor relations. We're going to help you with CSR and sustainability. And so the way our platform works is both companies, HP and CBS, type in their name of our platform. We've done a deep dive, proprietary data, on nearly 9,000 companies. Every company that has an ESG rating through MSCI, we know everything that company is doing in the area of CSR, sustainability, philanthropy. We know all the awards that they've won, all the nonprofits they're working. Then we pull their ESG rating from MSCI, True Value Labs, and CSR Hub, because we want to understand their ESG rating from a couple different angles. Then we pull the standards they're using, Scott, from GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, SASB, around sustainable accounting, to deem whether the projects we're going to serve are financially material to their industry or their company. And then we pull some custom Nielsen data on what do your employees care about and what do your customers care about. We take all that data. We have a network of hundreds of nonprofits and have thousands of programs. And we run that data and the algorithm starts to run, and it realizes that both HP and CBS are both interested in diverse workforce development. And the algorithm runs, and the top algorithmic match was an organization called Black Girls Code that teaches girls of color coding skills so they can fill the tech jobs of the future. So CBS then says, okay, so best pricing, best terms, but in addition to that, HP is going to underwrite 500 girls of color through Black Girls Code to get coding skills in 13 US markets. Now, every issue area, nonprofit, and program in our platform, we have 3-minute videos, 60s, 30s, 15s. We have pre-written press releases, newsletters, blog posts, and investor relations decks that go to both sides, both the seller and the buyer. We have the largest social impact nonprofit content library in the world. We have thousands and thousands of pieces of content that our studio has produced from Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, Peru, Guatemala, all over the United States and in the UK, so all over the world. And so what we do is 2 forms of match, measure, and report. We match issuers, nonprofits, and programs with suppliers and buyers that create the most material amount of business value for the supplier and the buyer. We then write from a fraction of the transaction, we write a grant agreement to the nonprofit. We do not write checks to the Washington, D.C. headquarters and say spend it wisely. We write grant agreements that have specific outcomes, outputs, and impacts that we verify, validate, and measure and report. So we do all the reporting back to the supplier, the buyer, rating agencies, and standard setters. Then we take that content library, that massive content library, and we start matching it with stakeholders. We send it to employees and say, how does it make you feel that your employer is underwriting coding skills for girls of color? And we measure the response of those employees, and we report that back to the corporations. And so we use a number of tools that are in the SAP ecosystem. We use Ariba, where the transactions take place. We use Qualtrics, which is a survey platform. So we use tools that are in that SAP ecosystem to deliver that business value to both the supplier and the buyer. So in this case, a transaction was leveraged into an agent for social change, and significant business value was delivered to both the supplier and the buyer. And in this case, 500 girls of color got coding skills as a result of just a transaction. And so that's what I mean by leveraging the power of B2B transactions and B2G transactions as an agent for positive social change. And we can do that not as an act of charity or philanthropy. What I just described is not charity, it's not philanthropy. I'm not asking for money from the corporate foundation. Whatever you're going to give from your foundation, you continue to give to whichever nonprofit you're working with. We're not interested in disrupting that. What we're interested in doing is creating new funding for those nonprofits from activities that those nonprofits had never benefited from before. So we want to create new incremental funding for these nonprofits and open the floodgates for new funding for taking on the most pressing issues of our time.
So as I'm listening, the pattern that's starting to emerge is actually there's a clear pattern that starts as early as the Adopt a Highway to your Givewith.
Adopt a Waterway. Yeah, Adopt a Waterway program.
Adopt a Waterway to the Givewith, which is this notion of, sitting basically, I call it the highway of transactions, but sitting at the highway of transactions and making sure that any transactions that go on that infrastructure or that highway, you're able to reallocate or redirect some of that for social cause impacts. A couple of questions on what you just shared is, I think it's, the thing with the ESG is it's a negative filter, which means that indirectly it is essentially penalizing those that are not ranking high enough in this kind of composite filter methodology. And the other aspect is because for them to be even listed at the MSCI, SCR Hub, and GRBN and so forth, they have to be a certain size in terms of market cap and growth, which means that in some ways there needs to be another account for smaller businesses. Otherwise, they're just never going to make it into the RFP or the RFI. The last point I want to make is, some of the research indicates that when it comes to social impact and the kinds of spends that brands make, they recommend empirically where it makes the biggest benefit is client-facing or customer-facing. So a lot of these transactions you're talking about at the SAP Ariba level is really more B2B. So some of these things may never actually surface up at the end customer level. So I'm just curious to see how you would address some of these questions.
Yeah, we have a bit of a flywheel, Scott, if you will. The flywheel is in effect, step one on the flywheel is helping suppliers, sellers, apply social impacts as part of the sales process. Secondly, same company, same flywheel, helping buyers, helping their sourcing and procurement platforms leverage their purchasing power to underwrite social impacts as part of their purchasing power. And then all of those engagements that I talked about, that's what we call social impact sales, social impact sourcing, and then social impact sharing. And that sharing that I described is sharing with internal stakeholders like employees, external to the extent that it's investors, suppliers, and vendors, but then it's consumers. Because I shared with you that consumer, we work with large brands, Lexus, United Airlines, Wells Fargo, large brands, First Republic Bank, and others, where we then take that activity that's been generated and express it to the consumer. So everything from B2B and B2G sales, B2B and B2G sourcing and procurement, to sharing that with internal and external stakeholders and being able to measure it. So I'm really interested in the math associated with the business value connected to those social impacts. I always say when the math is undeniable, success is inevitable. And we have to be quite precise about which social impacts we're identifying and what is their material business value when it goes around that flywheel. How do we squeeze all of the business value out of those corporate functions to ultimately create the most amount of money for improving struggling communities and at-risk populations and taking on pressing issues and create business value? And so the math has to be quite precise.
Yeah. So we're out of time. I wish we had a little bit more time to talk about how your product development could eventually extend to impact accounting, which gets into really the forensics and the detail mathematics that you're talking about from a function. What is the destination that the listeners should go to learn more about Givewith?
Givewith.com. And I'm sorry that we ran out of time. Thank you for having me. I wish we had more time because I've really enjoyed being part of your podcast today.
So today I've been joined by Paul Polizzotto, who is the CEO of Givewith. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Scott. Appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.